I'm in Tirana, Albania, and today we're talking about the country with the worst music taste in Europe. Yes, you read the title right, we're talking about the country that completely banned rock and roll on its most prominent years and the effect this had not only on the music scene of Albania, but on the country as a whole. If you couldn't guess already, this ban happened due to our little communist phase, and in this video I'm gonna show the effects nationalism and a paranoid dictator can have on art and music. So without further ado, make sure to subscribe if you're a true Albanian, and enjoy! This is Albania, the country that banned rock and roll. If you're still confused with what I mean by banning rock and roll, let me explain. After World War II, Albania became a communist regime ruled by a totalitarian dictator called Enver Hoxha. Now, if you don't know Enver Hoxha, then you're really missing out on some Albanian lore. Hoxha was a real communist through and through, and he wasn't gonna let anyone mess with his ideas. And I don't say this as a joke. While he was in power, he managed to completely isolate Albania from the rest of the world because he was paranoid that foreign influences were gonna make his people turn against them, or even worse, invade Albania. He obviously started by banning any type of Western influences or Western art as a whole because it was deemed as anti-communist propaganda. But he didn't stop there. In 1960, Albania officially cut ties with the Soviet Union because, well, they weren't communist enough for him since they decided to split from China. Funny thing is that Hoxha also cut ties from China 10 years later after Nixon decided to visit the country. In Hoxha's mind, Albania was unfortunately the only real communist country left, and he decided to split them from the rest of the world. That's why there's YouTube videos out there calling us the North Korea of Europe. Now, I'm gonna get into Hoxha later, but his regime completely killed any chances that Albania might have had to create an actual music scene during these years. I know this doesn't sound like the biggest issue in the world when you compare it to like children starving, but this total control Hoxha had over everything made it impossible for people to speak up against him and challenge the very heavy communist propaganda that was going on at the time. If you haven't noticed already, Albania became a communist country in 1946 and ended this regime in 1991. Those are literally the most important years in music history, at least when it comes to rock and roll, and Albania completely missed out on it. There were no Beatles, no Stones, no Pink Floyd, no The Doors, no nothing. There weren't even the Smiths. Usually, if you ask an old person in the West what the best band of all time is, they'll probably say the Beatles, but if you ask an old person here, they probably won't even know them. Obviously, there's people who listen to them now, since we haven't had communism in like 30 years, but for your average grandpa who doesn't know English and doesn't know how to use the internet, he wouldn't have any idea what you're talking about. So from 1947 to 1991, Albanians were not allowed to listen to any type of Western music, or even read or look at Western art. Now, the interesting thing is that there was a part of Albania who managed to escape this rule, because at the time, they were a part of Yugoslavia. I am of course talking about Kosovo. I don't know if you've ever seen that picture of the lights in North Korea versus South Korea, but that's exactly how the music scene is in Albania versus in Kosovo. It's amazing what can happen when you actually have access to the rest of the world. The story of Albania and Kosovo is very long, and I'm not gonna get too much into it. But for any American out there who has no idea what I'm talking about, Kosovo is an independent country in the north of Albania. As we're speaking right now, the population of Kosovo is 97% Albanian, but Serbia does not recognize its independence because of history. There was a war in the 90s that ended with NATO bombing innocent civilians in Serbia because the Serbian army tried to forcefully remove Albanians out of Kosovo, and because of that war, we got this amazing song.
Thank you, USA, you are my best friend, you are the peacekeeper, you are the legend.
On the 17th of February 2008, Kosovo declared independence from Serbia, and as of right now, 104 UN countries recognize this independence. It's basically like Ireland and Northern Ireland, but if America came in and bombed the shit out of the UK. At least that's how I see it from my perspective. Now, I'm sure there's gonna be a lot of Serbs in the comments who are gonna respectfully disagree with me, and I'm totally not gonna have a Balkan war in the comments, but even if you disagree with me, I think everyone can admit that a part of the Kosovo population was Albanian during the last century, however big you think that part is. This creates a scenario where you can see how Albanian music would have sounded like if we had access to Western influences. Of course, this is just a little sample because Yugoslavia wasn't really the biggest fan of showing Albanian artists, and also most of our population still had no idea what the Beatles were. But let's actually dive into the rock and roll scene of Kosovo. The first ever Albanian rock and roll band was actually called Blue Star and was a cover band of Western music. They formed in '64 in Pristina and later changed their name to Modestet. I tried to search them up on YouTube and I think I found them, and also one of the guys weirdly looks like Schlatt. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of information on these guys, and the Wikipedia page of Albanian music in the 60s is literally like 3 sentences long. So compare that to Beatlemania and the British invasion and whatever happened in the West. There were two other Albanian bands who formed in the 60s, and they were called LEHT, which formed in 1965, and Marimangat, which formed in 1968. Marimangat, by the way, means the spiders in Albanian. While Blue Star or Modesta didn't really evolve much from traditional Albanian music, Marimangat seemed to sound more modern and Western, at least for the time. There's an interview from the New Year's Eve of 1969 where the band explains that they got their name after they saw a spider in an English girl's hotel room. Even the way the band dressed, talked and sang was very English. By the way, I looked more into this band because I just found out about them and I think it's the coolest thing ever. The frontman's name is DHIMBJE, and not only is this guy Albanian Jim Morrison, but he's also the first ever person in history to make a music video in Albanian. He continued making music after the 60s and ended up influencing both the Turkish and Albanian music scene of the time. He's admitted that one of his biggest influences were the Beatles, if it wasn't obvious enough from his music, and unfortunately he died in 2018. So rest in peace DHIMBJE, I wish more Albanians could hear your music. Now the 70s is where things get slightly more interesting. In 1973 in Mitrovica, the band MAC was formed, which was a bi-ethnic band. MAC managed to evolve Albanian music even further, and it was one of the first bands to introduce Albanians to the rock and roll sound of the 70s. Not only that, but their lyrics started evolving from simple love songs to political and social messages. The frontman of the band, Haki Misini, died in 1999 fighting the Serbian army during the Kosovo War. Albanians have a long history of using art to fight oppression. Even the guy on our $2 bill used his work to fight against the oppression of the Ottoman Empire. Now, while MAC was doing all of this in Kosovo, back in communist Albania, things were getting even stricter. 146 artists got arrested or sent to hard labor because they were conspiring against the country. Enver Hoxha was not letting anyone make even the tiniest peep. During this heavy censoring, the only music that was allowed to be played in television was simple stuff like this. While that was being played in Albania, in 1974, Kosovo managed to create their first yearly music festival called Lindja, or the Youth. This was huge news for Kosovo, who was already growing more and more both financially and culturally. Lindja managed to introduce a bunch of new Albanian bands who were going to become an important part of Albanian music during the next 3 decades. The most famous of these bands probably being TNT. TNT formed in 1978 by Lindja, who had already started making music since the 60s and got most of their fame after the 90s, aka after Albania was done with their communist regime. The band was mostly a combination of traditional Albanian music and rock and roll. While MAC unfortunately dismembered in 1978, their ideas pierced through well into the 80s, and the first band to pick up where MAC left was none other than my favorite Albanian band ever, Gjurmet. See, in this video I talked a lot about Enver Hoxha, but I didn't really touch on Yugoslavia because, well, where do you even start? Despite the fact they weren't nearly as paranoid as Enver Hoxha, there was still a lot of heavy censorship going on, not only for Albanians. They just thought they could use Western music to spread their own propaganda. In the 80s, bands started to get even more brave, and they were using their music to fight against the political system of Yugoslavia. The problem was that this music had to serve as both a way to counter communism and keep the Albanian tradition alive at the same time. So Gjurmet started focusing more on their national identity. Alright, some extra info I forgot to mention when I was recording. Gjurmet released their first album in '85 called Të Vallëzojmë, or Let's Dance in English. Because of the censorship, both the cover and title had to be changed, since it featured 2 Albanian dancers doing the eagle symbol with their bodies. Now the band dismembered in '86, but got back again in 2002 to release a compilation album of their 80s work. This brings us to the Gjurmet LP. I truly think this LP is the best work the Albanian rock scene has to offer. If you're a fan of 80s post-punk bands like The Cure, Susie and the Banshees, Television, Talking Heads, you will probably end up enjoying this album. It's very well produced, it's creative, it sounds way more evolved than any other Albanian band, and if you decide to listen to anything from this video, it should probably be this LP. With the death of Tito and the rise of instability in Yugoslavia, Albania started growing even more concerned about their national identity. This and the start of Kosovo's first ever rock festival in '82 called Boom led to the creation of some of the most important Albanian bands ever. Bands like Ilirët, 403, Telex, Seleksioni 39, Minatorët, and of course Gjurmet itself. All of these bands made it their top priority to preserve the Albanian identity in a time of crisis. But the 80s brought another aspect to Albanian music except national identity, and that was punk. The Albanian punk scene would only really develop after the 90s, where the first ever band to bring this sound to the Albanian people was Lindja in 1983. Lindja not only had heavily charged political lyrics, but they also brought a sound that was inspired by the punk and post-punk band of the 70s and 80s. This brought Albanian music to a point where it had never been before, and it managed to influence a lot of 90s acts that were about to come out. Fortunately for us, Lindja is still active to this day and dropped their first album in 2004. aka When I Was Born. The last fortunate thing to happen to Albanian music in the 80s was the death of Enver Hoxha. Yes, he died while he was in power and there were people crying in the street after his death. That's how strong his propaganda was. After the death of Hoxha, DIELLI took control of the country, but with the fall of other communist regimes in the Eastern Bloc, he slowly started fearing for his life. On the 12th of February 1991, the Albanian students went on a protest and brought down the giant statue of Enver Hoxha. And soon after that, the Communist Party fell and democracy was back in Albania. The 90s were hectic in this country. There were protests, new parties, mass immigration, pyramid schemes, a civil war, and the Kosovo War. I don't have time to get into all of this because there was so much corruption that the leader of the Democratic Party in the 90s only got arrested 2 years ago, even though he fucking shot like peaceful protesters. Anyways, Hoxha was dead, democracy was back, and that meant that actual rock music could be made by Albanians in Albania. We started very strongly with the creation of Albanian metal music. The first ever band to bring this genre to Albanian audiences was Albatros in 1989. They only have one song and they dismembered after the 90s, but this song became very popular and ended up influencing a lot of 90s bands. Albatros unfortunately didn't last too long, but the members of the band managed to create two other Albanian metal bands called Thunderwave and Megahertz. Also, in the same year of '89, Aleksandar Gjoga organized the first ever rock concert in Albania. Aleksandar Gjoga is still a big name to this day and is one of the most legendary artists in Albanian music. Some other metal/rock bands to come of this era were Aku Thuesit, Tingulli Zjarrt, Centaur, Djemtë Detit, and more. But perhaps the most important metal band of this era was Crossbones.
Get in my eyes, get in my soul.
Crossbones formed in 1995 and they're still active to this day. They released their first album in 1997 called Days of Rage, and some of the heaviest music you'll ever hear from any Albanian band. The punk scene also continued in the 90s with bands like The Fishhook by Buck and Dako, which is another famous singer here, Gutter Snipe, and one of the biggest punk bands ever, Jericho. Jericho formed in 1997 and the main theme of their lyrics is Albanian pride. They even combine rock and punk elements with Albanian traditional music. Another important band of the 90s is ASGJE. ASGJE continued on the steps of Gjurmet and they released their first album in 1991 called One, which also features their biggest song. Okay, I know that was a lot of names you probably can't pronounce, but there's one more band I need to mention in this video. This band is the cherry on top and it's probably the one band every Albanian knows. That's of course LEHT. LEHT formed in 1988 in North Macedonia and is the only Albanian band to really hit mainstream, with one of their songs having over 22 million views. As I said, it's the one band that really introduced rock and roll to the Albanian population. After the 90s there were some rock bands here and there, but none of them really made a splash in Albanian culture as much as LEHT did. The country was going through some difficult times in the 2000s and 2010s, and rock was basically dead everywhere. The average Albanian completely missed out on some of the greatest musical eras and bands ever, and that was because of some paranoid mania. Nowadays the biggest music genre here is hip-hop, which is fine, and I think some Albanian rappers have even found fame outside of Albania. What's interesting to see is that even in hip-hop and 30 years after communism fell, Artists from Kosovo sound better and more evolved than Albanian artists. It's crazy what decades of Western influences can do to art and music. MC Kresha, a rapper from Kosovo, even sampled a song from Gjurmet, one of the bands I talked about in the 80s, and it's one of his biggest songs ever. So to summarize everything, I just wanted to say that communism had a detrimental effect on Albanian rock and roll. Years of heavy censorship and paranoia have resulted in a very lackluster music scene in 2025, and I don't think we can ever know how Albanian music could have sounded like if Enver Hoxha didn't do everything he did. Not only music, but even Albanian cinema has been in a very poor place these last 5, 10, 15 years. I don't know if it was because of the censorship or the fact they missed out on so many great eras, but I think Albanian artists now are scared to really challenge themselves. I think if this video does good, I might make another video on Albanian cinema, but we'll see. Albania is not really the greatest place for art, but for anyone who is interested in Albanian art, I'll suggest looking more into Northern and Kosovo artists. That's all I had to say for this video. I hope I didn't make it too confusing or hard to follow. Make sure to check out all the bands I mentioned in this video, and check out my Discord and Patreon down below. This is my first time filming with a camera. Let me know how you guys like it, and goodbye. Dhe do shtypësh atë butonin e ke nga anash. Ti do të shtypë I herë sa 20 drita bardh. E ke nga anash fare. Jo aty, nga ana tjetër. Po. Do ta kesh I buton vogël. Ja aty.